A human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. That's what it means to be a human being. That's why slavery is immoral. Think about it. Why is it that it's wrong to enslave someone? Because you're treating him as if he's not a human being with his own rational judgment that should guide his life. Rand zeroes in on all these observations and many more. What she realizes is that because it is true that we must act on our judgment in order to live as human beings, and because to the extent that force is used against us, we can't do that, we need a principle, we need to formulate a principle that is a recognition of this fact. And that principle is the principle of rights.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I am Reem Ibrahim, the Communications Officer here at the IEA. I'm also the Linda Whetson Scholar. I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Craig Biddle. He is the co-founder and executive director of Objective Standard Institute, co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Objective Standard, and executive director of the Prometheus Foundation. Quite a mouthful. He's also the author of Loving Life, The Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts That Support It. It's a fantastic book. This is a recorded session, so it will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel afterwards. Craig will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then it'll be open to you guys to ask as many questions as you like. So, Craig, over to you.
Thank you so much, Reem, and thank you all for coming. So I've been asked to speak about Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism and its connection to liberty, or the broader liberty movement, and what it offers to people who are interested in advancing liberty. So I'll do that, but I want to just preface this with objectivism. This philosophy that Ayn Rand developed is a really big philosophy. I mean, it covers major issues in all of the branches of philosophy, the nature of reality or metaphysics, how we know what's true, and how we can arrive at knowledge and validate our knowledge, and that's epistemology. Ethics, what is good, how should we act, and so on. And then politics and aesthetics. So it covers all of this. I want to sort of whet your appetite about this philosophy by focusing today just on one element of it that I think will show you the value of the philosophy or the logic of it and its usefulness in life. And what I want to focus on is Ayn Rand's theory of rights, how it is that she grounds this idea of rights, right? So life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, those rights, in reality, in perceptual reality, where we can see that they're real and that we have them and that this theory is true. So that's what I'm going to do, and then we can broaden the discussion in the Q&A if you want to go beyond that. So, for eons, well, not eons, but since Adam Smith, we'll start there, we have substantially known, many people have, that the freer societies are, the more prosperous they are. And there's pretty clear direct connection as to why, right? When people are free to think and produce and trade, then they do that thing and they specialize, and we all get wealthy because we kind of zero in on something we like to do that we can offer in the marketplace, and then we can trade with other people and we can live in harmony. And so, from Adam Smith through Ludwig von Mises through Thomas Sowell and all the great, economists in between, this has been demonstrated. And every year we see in the Wall Street Journal and different organizations that study economic well-being, that the freer countries, because they run these economics or indexes of economic freedom. And we see every year that the freer a society is, the more prosperous they are. But why then are we losing substantially still the battle for liberty, right? It's been shown over and over again that the freer people are, the more prosperous they're going to be. But we're still losing this battle in many ways and in pretty much every country. So why? And I think the reason is because we don't know the moral argument for liberty. There's the economic argument, and there's a moral argument. And the moral argument is actually more fundamental. But the reason people don't know that we have that is because they just don't understand what rights are and where they come from. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea. Is it true that we morally should be free? Is it true that freedom is good, right? Good and should are moral terms. If it's true that we should be free, then there must be some moral principle by reference to which it is true that we should be free, right? True. Good and should aren't just floating things out there. If something is good or you should do it, there's some reason that you should do it. There's some fact that we can point to that says, yeah, here's the why, right? And so traditionally, the answer to the question, should we be free or is freedom good, is answered by recourse to the idea of rights, right? You have a right to act as your life requires, to pursue the values of your choosing, to act on your own judgment free of coercion. These are the rights to life, liberty, property. Property is the right to keep, use, and dispose of the things you produce. The right to the pursuit of happiness is the right to go after the values that you think will fill your life with joy, right? So these are the real rights, right? The rights to action, not the rights to be given goods and services. We'll throw those aside because you guys know that that's not the essence of what we mean when we talk about real rights. So this is the theory. We have rights. We have we have a moral prerogative to act on our judgment and keep the stuff we produce. Okay, so that's the theory. Is it true? Is it true that we have these things? It's one thing to have a theory, but can we demonstrate it? And in the history of thought on this, there have been three basic ideas on this. And that is, one, that rights come from God, and that's why we have them, and why it's true that we have them. And the other one is that rights come from government, and that's why we have them, and why it's true. And the other one is that rights come from nature. But all three of these theories are really problematic, and I'm going to zip through them because I want to get to the one that's not problematic. So if rights come from God, then what's the first thing you have to prove that you have rights? You have to prove that God exists, right? And this is a very tall order. In my view, it's an impossible order, but take it either way. It doesn't matter what your position is on God. The fact of the matter is that if you've got to prove that God exists to prove that you have rights, you're going to have trouble proving that you have rights. And nobody has proven that God exists, and nobody has proven that rights come from his consciousness to us on that basis. So that's just a dead end, it really is, and it hasn't worked and it won't work. Then we get to the idea that rights come from government. Well, this is a bastardization of language. This is to equate rights with laws, but rights and laws are not the same thing. What the government tells you may and may not do, those are called laws. Those are the laws of the land. The whole reason we have a separate concept of rights is that rights are supposed to be the things you have a moral prerogative to do regardless of what government or legal systems tell you have a right to do. The purpose of rights is to inform governments and legal systems of what laws they may and may not legislate and enforce. So the idea that your rights come from government is just a conflation of terms that don't belong together, right? They're not the same thing. So then we get to this idea that, well, your rights come from nature, and this sounds great until we start to think about it, and it gets really difficult. Okay, if they come from nature, where are they in nature? If you go out there looking for them in the streets or in the woods, are you going to find rights? No, they're not out there anywhere. If you cut me open, are you going to find them in here? Are they in nature in the sense that my heart is in nature? No, they're not in there either. So this is a problem. If we can't find the rights in nature, we can't specify where they come from, we're in trouble. So how have the natural rights theorists dealt with this in the history of this idea? What they've done is they've said, well, your rights depend on a natural moral law. They derive from a natural moral law. And John Locke famously talked about this, as did the American founders. But the problem is, where is it that John Locke and company say the natural moral law comes from? God. Which means we're back here at the idea that your rights come from God, and if you can't prove that God exists and somehow your rights emanate from his will, you don't know and can't prove that you have rights. So this is a real problem. Who loves that we can't prove that we have rights? The communists love it. The socialists love it, the fascists love it, the theocrats love it. They all love this idea that we can't prove that we have rights. Jeremy Bentham famously said that rights are nonsense upon stilts. Why? You can't show any evidence to support them. Alasdair MacIntyre says that rights are one with witches and unicorns. Why? Because there's an equal amount of evidence to support the existence of these things. If we don't have the moral case for liberty, we don't have the case for liberty, because all the leftists and socialists have to do is say, you can't prove you have rights. But we all know that the greatest good for the greatest number, or from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, or the fact that you know that sacrificing for other people is the right thing to do, and you have a moral prerogative to do, a moral obligation to do that, that's all going to be true. So we have this big problem. We need to show that we have rights, and nobody has done it until Rand. So Rand comes along, and she has a completely different approach to rights than the traditional approaches. She doesn't turn out there and say where they come from God, or they come from society or government. And when she gets to the issue of they come from nature, or do they come from nature, she starts to ask very Aristotelian questions about the nature of the kind of thing we're talking about here. What is the nature of this animal we're talking about, a human being? What is it that makes us human? And she zeroes in on the fact that the thing that makes us human is our capacity of reason, our faculty of reason. We are able to use our minds to figure out what things are and figure out how to put them together and build things so that we can create the values on which our life depends. And reason is the faculty that enables us to do this. And you can see this throughout history. I mean, why did we move from the cave to where we are today, where we have satellites, streaming this discussion here across the world, right? And everything in between. Literally, you guys have read iPencil, right? You know how difficult it is to make a pencil and how many people are involved in that, right? From the people who make the rubber to the people who make the paint, people who do the transportation, all of that, right? Think about the astonishing amount of productivity that human beings have engaged in over the time since we left the cave, and what faculty made that possible? Reason. We live by using our minds to figure out what's true and then by acting on our judgment. So Rand observes this fact and all of the evidence to support it, right? And says, in effect, because we are a rational animal, and this doesn't mean that human beings are always rational. That's obviously not true. What it means is that we have the capacity of reason. We have the faculty of reason and can use it to make our lives, to figure out what's true and to make our lives great. So she says, in effect, given that we have this thing, what is the one thing that human beings can do to each other that can stop them from acting on their judgment? And the answer is they can use physical force against each other. If I'm on an island all alone and building a hut and going fishing and figuring out what berries are edible and trying to do all the things using my mind, right? And I can do as I wish. I can use my judgment to live. If you're bigger than me and you row up on the island and strap me to a tree, can I act on my judgment now? Obviously not. So we can see right at the perceptual level, this is very important, we can see right at the perceptual level that force stops a human being from acting on his or her judgment, right? To the extent that force is used, it stops a human being from acting on his or her judgment, right? If you let me go and say, well, you can make stuff and wander around the island, but anything you produce belongs to me or I'll strap you back to the tree, then I'm free to act on my judgment more than I was strapped to the tree, but I'm still not able to live as a human being, right? I'm still living sort of as a serf or as a slave. A human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind. That's what it means to be a human being. That's why slavery is immoral. Think about it. Why is it that it's wrong to enslave someone? Because you're treating him as if he's not a human being with his own rational judgment that should guide his life. That's why slavery is wrong. Rand zeroes in on all these observations and many more. I'm giving you a shotgun version of this. But what she realizes is that because it is true that we must act on our judgment in order to live as human beings, and because to the extent that force is used against us, we can't do that, we need a principle. We need to formulate a principle that is a recognition of this fact. And that principle is the principle of rights. This is what the principle of rights is. It's simply the recognition. So people get confused about rights because they think either rights have to come from out there somewhere, like God gives them to us or government gives them to us, right? Or they've got to be somehow in nature where we can see them or something. You cut me open and they're in there, or you find them out there or something like that. But Rand gets around this seeming dichotomy by simply pointing out that there is an in here part, right? Oh, and if by the way they're not in nature or out there, then people think, well, they're just made up in our minds. We just say that we have rights. It's just like an assertion. Rand gets around this problem by pointing out that there is an in here part. There is a mind aspect of this. Obviously, we are recognizing something. That's a cognitive action. What is it that we're recognizing? It's the fact that we're a certain kind of animal and that we have to act in a certain way in order to live. We have to be free to act on our judgment in order to live, and force used against us stops us from doing that. So the principle of individual rights is simply the recognition of the fact that a human life is a life guided by the judgment of one's own mind, and that force, to the extent it's used against a human being, stops him from being able to live as a human being. This is an evidence-based, observation-based, logically sound approach to rights. And we have it now. We didn't have this before Rand, because although this sounds really, you guys are sitting there going, this really makes sense, right? Who's saying that in your heads? Like, this makes sense. It does make sense, but people don't know it yet. And so one of my big goals in life is to help people sort of get their head around this. Now, there's more to it, and you're not, I'm not expecting anyone here to accept this idea or this theory as true just on the basis of a few minutes hearing me talk about it. But what I want to do is urge you to look into it. Look into Ayn Rand's theory of rights. Look into her explanation of why it is that we have these things. And look into the way that she protects this. And this is the last thing I want to say before we jump to Q&A. The difficulty of getting this theory into people's minds and getting them to realize that it's true and embrace it and use it as the underpinning for all of these economic arguments for liberty is that the very idea that you have a right to act on your judgment for your sake is completely contrary to traditionally held morality. Auguste Comte, the French philosopher who coined the term altruism. Altruism means otherism. It means you should live for others. You should self-sacrificially serve others, and that's what it means to be moral. Comte coined this term, altruism, to denote the moral code that is correct, right? And he was secular, by the way, so he said this is a secular thing. Now, this dovetails perfectly with Christianity and the idea that you should sacrifice for other people and living for others is the right thing to do. Comte and then the utilitarians who followed him, including Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, held that you can't have rights because rights would be immoral. Because it would mean that you don't have to live for other people. It would mean that you have a moral prerogative to act on your own judgment for your own sake. Comte said the very notion of rights has to be put away forever. He said it's immoral and it's wrong and it's completely contrary to morality. Well, if morality means living for others or sacrificing for others, then it's true that there's a contradiction between rights and morality. And this is why Ayn Rand, in addition to coming up with her theory of rights, also went way deeper and talked about why it is that it's not true that you should sacrifice for other people and living for others is right. That's why she wrote a book titled The Virtue of Selfishness. Controversial title, very sort of provocative title. But she meant it, because what she meant is that being moral doesn't consist of living for other people. It consists in taking your life seriously, figuring out what you need to do to build a beautiful life, have a career that you love, relationships that you love, and so on, and figuring out how to defend your freedom so that you can do that thing, and so that you can trade with other people who are being thoughtful and productive, so that we can all live beautiful, self-interested lives and live in harmony with each other rather than at each other's throats and trying to steal each other's stuff. Right? So the very idea of rights is controversial even before Rand proves that we have them, because the thinkers, including the utilitarians, who said, the standard of morality is the greatest good for the greatest number. Does that sound at all reminiscent of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs? It's the same principle. That's communism. The end of the road, if we just say that the being moral consists in serving the greater good, is serving the community. Communism. It's the same thing. We have to get away from collectivism and the idea that rights and the proper way of living has anything to do with collectivity or collectivism. We're all individuals. Groups are simply made up of individuals. And the key to understanding how we can live beautifully together is to recognize that we're all individuals. We all have our own mind, we all have our own lives, and we all need to be free to act on our judgment. The only way we're going to be able to defend liberty solidly, on solid ground, is by understanding a theory of rights that's provable, and by being willing to go even deeper and think through whether or not the traditional morality that we've been taught is true. If it's not true, if there's nothing to support it, and there isn't, I think you'll find that if you start asking the hard questions, then we need to abandon it and we need to adopt a moral code that actually does support it. And that's Ayn Rand's theory of self-interest being moral, which we can talk more about in the Q&A. So that's just an indication, and I'll close with this. The books that I would recommend reading, if you haven't read Rand's works yet, are her fiction, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged in particular, really wonderful novels that sort of depict heroes and villains, around these kinds of ideas that we're talking about here. And then her nonfiction, which includes The Virtue of Selfishness, where she explains her moral theory and why it doesn't mean stabbing people in the back to get what you want, but it means being thoughtful and rational and living in harmony with other people. And then her book that focuses more on politics and economics, which is titled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And finally, her book, my favorite of her nonfiction, is Philosophy Who Needs It, which is a series of essays about why you need philosophy and why there's no escaping it. Because you basically have a philosophic system in your mind that you're already living by. The only question is, have you thought through it, or did you adopt it, sort of secondhand through the culture? And she advocates that you think through it and decide for yourself whether what you're holding on to there is true. So anyway, that's a very quick sort of introduction to why I think Ayn Rand's ideas are really worth studying. And with that, we'll take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Craig. That was wonderful. So we're obviously joined by fantastic young professionals, the brightest minds and students as well. Before I open up to them, I just want to ask about objectivism sort of as a moral philosophy in itself. So a lot of objectivists won't call themselves libertarians, although I think that they, broadly speaking, hold a libertarian political philosophy. With libertarianism, all you get is sort of don't hurt me and don't touch my stuff. But that isn't quite enough to live a flourishing life. So what is objectivism and why do we need that as a moral philosophy?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I actually wrote an article about this titled Libertarianism versus Radical Capitalism, which you can look up, that will go into further detail on this. But the problem here is that not everyone who calls himself or herself a libertarian today holds this view. But in the history of the libertarian movement, it has been prevalent, this idea that, hey, we don't need to talk about morality and deeper philosophy and all that controversial stuff. That's where it gets prickly down there, and we don't go there. We just need a big tent, and if you say you're for liberty, and she says she's for liberty, and you say you're, then we can all hold hands and sing liberty, liberty, and we'll be fine. This doesn't work. And it doesn't work because people's moral views trump their economic views. You can learn the economics of liberty. But if you're holding on to the idea that being moral consists in living for other people, you're going to agree with Auguste Comte that you can't have rights and morality at the same time. They're in conflict, and they are, if that's what you think morality means. There's no escaping the need of a moral foundation for liberty. We need it. If you concede the moral argument for liberty, you concede the argument for liberty. And look, it's happening. I wrote another article titled The Passion of Socialists, which is all about this. Why is it that socialists have so much chutzpah behind? They're like, we're morally right and you capitalists are greedy, bad people. And the capitalists come back with, no, we think that it's good to help others too. Don't get it. It's all defensive, right? Why? Because we don't know that we have the moral case for our position. But we do. This is the point. But if you concede the moral argument, if you go, yeah, you should live for other people, but the way to do that is to have freedom, And that way people are free to do their thing, and of course maybe some of them won't serve other people, but that's okay because enough will, and it gets all muddy, right? And it gets impossible to support that. If instead you say, human beings are individuals, every single one of us has to act on his or her judgment to produce and achieve values. Human life, the requirements of human life are the standard of moral value, and we can prove that. And the best way for human beings to live together is to recognize these facts, and that undergirds this thing called liberty. It literally pulls the rug out from under the socialists and fascists and the theocrats. They can't withstand us having the moral case. But we do have the moral case, just nobody knows it. So that's the thing. So yeah, the liberty movement has long held that hey, don't get into the deep and controversial stuff. And I'm telling you guys, and I think you can probably tell just by thinking through this, we have to. And that's what Rand's philosophy is. One of the things Rand's philosophy is all about is going there.
I think we can only win the argument if we have a moral philosophy as well as a political one. Amazing. Do we have the microphone for the Q&A? Fantastic. So we'll open it up to all of you wonderful people. Who has a question for us? Great. Do you mind just saying your name and where you come from as well before you start?
Hello, I'm Matthew here, former IEA intern and student at LSE. So thank you for talking to us today. I just wonder why you think Ayn Rand's ideas, sort of objectivism, hasn't been taken seriously in academia, so in philosophy departments. Her ideas are sort of seen as fringe and not serious, not rigorous. Why do you think this is? Do you think this is due to a sort of left-wing bias in there, or do you think there's something, perhaps a more substantial reason why they don't take her ideas seriously?
Yeah, great question. So there are several reasons, and so I'll sort of blast some of them out there, and I think you'll get a flavor for what's going on here. So Rand is controversial on every level of philosophy. She's controversial at the level of metaphysics. What's the basic nature of reality? The basic nature of reality, according to religion, is that there are two worlds. There's this world, the natural world, and then there's a supernatural world. There's two worlds, and that we have to get our heads around that. And the supernatural world is, by the way, more important than this world, and we're going to go there when we're done. And there's also a guy there who tells us what's right and wrong, and we're supposed to obey him and all that. The subjectivist side says, man, there's no such thing as reality. There's just, we just make stuff up. It's whatever you say is true for you, and whatever I say is true for me, and there's this true for. Rand comes along and says, no, and she takes an Aristotelian approach. She says, no, there's one reality, the one we're dealing with here. We don't need to make up a second reality. That's what Aristotle called that senseless duplication when Plato did that, right? Made up the world of forms, which, by the way, became the Christian heaven. And Rand says there's one reality. Let's not pretend there's a second one. That just complexifies things, and there's no evidence for it anyway. So let's just focus on this one. And she says to the subjectivists, the idea that there's no reality is nonsense. You step in front of a speeding truck and see what happens, see whether reality is real. But it's controversial because she's denying what both camps want to hold on to, right? Then you get to epistemology, and again, controversial. Reason, she says, is your only means of knowledge. What does that mean about faith and revelation? They're out. What is faith? It's accepting ideas in the absence of evidence in support of them or in defiance of evidence in support of them. Have you ever seen a woman turn into a pillar of salt? You think that's actually possible? The Bible says it happened. Water turned to wine, a bush spoke, and so on and so forth. The whole thing is just, from a rational perspective, it's silly, right? Faith is not your means of knowledge. Just believing something to be true without evidence to support it does not make it true, right? So she's against the idea of faith as a means of knowledge. She's against the idea of emotions as a means of knowledge. Some people are like, well, if I feel it's true, it's true. And she says, no, your emotional faculty is an important faculty. It wouldn't be worth living if you didn't have your emotional faculty. That's your psychological means of experiencing your values, right? Think about loving someone, or your favorite team wins a game and you're happy, right? Or they lose and you're upset. Emotions are super important in our life, and so they're crucial, but they're not your means of knowledge. You have two mental faculties in your head. You have the faculty of emotion and you have the faculty of reason. One of them is your means of knowledge, and the other one is your means of psychologically experiencing your values. She says keep these things separate, and when you do keep them separate, guess what they do? They work beautifully in harmony together, right? You wouldn't treat your rational faculty as if it was your means of psychologically experiencing your values. So don't treat your emotional faculty as if it's your means of knowledge. It's not, right? But again, this is controversial because she's telling people reason is your only means of knowledge, and of course the religionists don't like this. Then we get to ethics. Everyone says being moral, consistent, selflessly serving other people. Anybody heard that in your life, right? Your parents told you this, your preachers told you this, your teachers told you this, it's in the media, everybody believes this. Rand comes along and says it's not true. And how do we know it's not true? Because there's no evidence to support it. There's not a shred of evidence to support the idea that you should sacrifice for other people. None. Which is why no one's ever presented the evidence. Ayn Rand says if you ask the question, why should I sacrifice for other people? No one can give you an answer. Try it. Talk to your preachers and people and say, why should I do that? They'll say, well, it says here so in the Bible. That's not evidence. That's a book. I wrote a book that says you shouldn't do that. And Rand wrote a book that says you should. So is that evidence? No. Evidence means there's some factor. What does it mean to understand something? It means that you see the ideas that stand under it and connect this idea to reality. What does it mean for an idea to make sense? It means that you can make it to the sensory level, right? You can take it to the sensory level in your mind. That's what evidence is. You can see evidence for it, like we just did for Ayn Rand's theory of rights. That's evidence. And she says of altruism the same thing. It's just a made-up idea about morality. There's nothing to support it. So it's true in my view, and I think if you guys look into it, you'll find that you will agree that it's true. But it is super controversial because it challenges 2,500 years of Judeo-Christian ethics. Then you get to I won't even get into aesthetics, but I'll just mention politics. Because she holds that we all should act on our own self-interest and live beautiful lives, and that therefore we must be free to act on our judgment so that we can do that thing, she holds that our political system has to honor those deeper truths. In other words, we need a political system that does one thing and one thing only, and that protects our right to act on our judgment free from force. This is what capitalism is. She stands for 100% pure laissez-faire capitalism. And so why is she controversial? Because at every stage she is going against the grain. Add to that she's not, she doesn't speak in academies. You know, she doesn't speak in the language that they use in philosophy departments. She writes in plain English. She dramatizes her ideas in fiction, in addition to writing nonfiction books that are crystal clear. And the academic philosophers don't like her because they're like, well, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to write in impenetrable fog like we do. And so there's that. And then I think there may be a little bit of misogyny. She's a woman philosopher, and I think some of the men in philosophy have been like, women can't reason. And so I think there's been a tad bit of that. So there's several factors. But I'm glad you asked that question because that was, this is, like, if you understand why Rand is hated so much, it should intrigue you all the more to be like, okay, I'm going to look into this and see what I think about it.
Hold your own opinion about it when you read it yourself, right?
Pardon?
Hold your own opinion about it when you read it yourself. Yeah. I just want to pick up on that point about fiction. I mean, Rand, just sort of looking at 20th century fiction, a lot of it is dominated by leftist authors, those that are arguing that, I'm thinking about the English GCSE spec where we've got a novel, plays like Inspector Calls that argue for collective responsibility and caring for others. And a lot of it is very altruistic. Why is fiction such an effective tool to communicate these philosophical ideas, and why did Rand do it so well?
That's a really great question, too. So why is fiction so effective in this regard? Because it concretizes for you right there in characters what it means to have these ideas play out. Whether the ideas that Rand is advocating, say in the characters of her fiction, in the characters of, for instance, Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead, or of Francisco de Cunha in Atlas Shrugged. You get to see what it means in action to adopt these ideas and use them. Likewise, for the villains in her novels, You get to see what it means to take seriously the idea that you should sacrifice for other people, that that's what it means to be moral. Have you read The Fountainhead? So there's a character in The Fountainhead named Catherine Halsey. And if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, make a special note to pay attention to her character in there, because she is one of these characters who takes seriously the idea that being moral consists in selflessly serving other people. And watch what it does to her, right? So you get to see that. You get to see, and she's not a villain, by the way. She's one of the people who's innocent, but has swallowed whole the idea that altruism is true. And then you see other characters in all of Rand's novels. What she does is she has extremes of extreme acceptance of certain ideas, and then she also has characters in the middle who are torn by what's right and what's wrong, and she plays out what happens to each of these characters based on those ideas in a very believable way. And that's why I think her novels are such powerful portrayals of her nonfiction ideas.
Great. Any more questions from the...
Hi, Rob White. I was a former intern here. So given that objectivism is a moral philosophy, why is it important to keep it separate or distinguish it from the philosophy or the view of small government?
So we don't want to keep objectivism separate from from our political views. On the contrary, we want to integrate them. So if it's true that government should be limited to a certain role, what is that role and why is it true? That's what philosophy helps you to answer, right? We have conservatives in the United States. I mean, I'm not as familiar with British politics, but in the United States, conservatives basically just stand for anti-left. They're against socialism and communism. But being against something is not anything to speak of. What are you for and why are you for it? What they need to say is we are for limited government meaning government that does one thing and one thing only. It protects individuals' rights to act on their own judgment for their own purposes. And that's morally correct government. And then if somebody says, well, why? How do you know that's morally correct? They can go, I'm glad you asked. Because human beings must act on their judgment in order to live fully as human beings. And that's what human beings should do. They should live as human beings, not as caged animals or slaves, and not as partial slaves or serfs who get to work, and keep some of their stuff, but the rest of it gets redistributed according to the powers that be. That's all wrong, and they should be left free to act on their own judgment. And then they ask, well, why is that true? They go, I'm glad you asked, because the whole purpose of morality, the whole reason we need the concept of morality and this field of study is because we don't automatically know what to do in order to live fully as human beings. So we need a field of study that tells us how to do that. And you can answer, like if you know how your political ideas connect to the theory of rights, and that connects to the theory of morality, and that connects to the nature of man, and that connects to the way that you know what's true and what isn't true, then you have the whole philosophic suite of ideas that support liberty. Guess who wins when we have the whole philosophic suite of ideas that support liberty? We do. This is like we have the ability to do this now. 50 or 60 years ago, we did not. Well, I mean, we did then too, but even fewer people understood it. The difficulty is getting other people to look into these ideas and see that they're true. Once you do see that they're true, you can't unsee it. You will be out there in the world going, oh my God, you got to understand this stuff because this is how we win the battle for liberty and for a civilized society. So don't decouple your political views from these ideas. Integrate them. Understand the underpinnings of the system of freedom. Rand's philosophy does just that. She actually said this of her moral code. She said that my moral code is simply the philosophically worked out proof of what the founding fathers implied in the Declaration of Independence. So they said man has rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and of course property is part of liberty. And that's what they said, and then they built a great country on top of that. But they didn't know how to defend those rights. They thought that rights were either self-evident right? That's in the Declaration itself. They say it's self-evident, or that it comes from that rights come from a creator, from God. So they were in the same sphere that most people are in. They didn't know how to prove rights. Then came Auguste Comte and the utilitarians and eviscerated the whole idea of rights. They were like, ha, 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 you can't prove that you have them, so you don't. And now we're going to have a new thing called you live for the state or you live for the collective. So the founders didn't have to contend with that. We do have to contend with it today. And that's why Rand is such a new, she's building on the shoulders of John Locke and the founders and Aristotle. She didn't invent the whole world of philosophy. But what she has added to it is phenomenally important. And if you understand it, and when you understand it, then you are equipped like you've never been before.
Don't need the mic.
Hi, I'm Ollie. I'm a former intern at the IEA. What's the objectivist approach on indentured servitude?
So indentured servitude is the idea that if I'm in debt to you and can't pay it, that I become your slave, in effect. And objectivism is against this, and we recognize the need...
Or alternatively, you can sell yourself into servitude.
That you could sell yourself into servitude. And objectivism is against both of these things simply on fundamental philosophic grounds. Your agreements with other people do not erase what you are. You are a human being and you need freedom of action to act and live as a human being. Now, if you make an agreement with someone, you have a moral obligation to uphold that agreement. If you borrow from someone, you have a moral obligation to pay that back. But morality is not a suicide pact, and it's not a slavery pact. And it can't be turned against human life because human life is the whole purpose of the thing. So it would be an inversion of the hierarchy of concepts to say that, oh yeah, I can make you a slave. It's like, no, morality is about our ability to live. So this is why I think things like bankruptcy law is legitimate, because what it does is it creates an out for people when there is a problem. But it's an end of the line out. It's like you do everything you can before going there, but that's the recourse. So let's say you loan me money and I can't pay it back, and I keep trying and I just can't do it because for whatever reason. Maybe I got severe brain damage or something and I can't do the work that I thought I was going to be able to do. And you might be like, well, okay, the solution is you can come be my servant for the rest of your life. And the law steps in properly and just says, no, when you make agreements under a proper legal code, one of the stipulations, even if it's an unspoken stipulation, is that the agreement is to be upheld, all things considered, as long as it can be upheld. But if there's some reason that it can't, then we have bankruptcy law and you suffer the consequences. And so you just know when you're contracting with someone that is part of the contract.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Michael from the LC, and so you keep saying that these ideas of rights are important so as to allow humans to live as human beings, but that appears to beg the question of why it's a moral imperative that we are allowed to live as human beings. Like, why is that why do we have to be allowed to do that? Why can't we choose to live as something else if we so desire?
Yeah, great question. So this really kind of goes to the whole base, and this is where Rand's genius and the value of her philosophy becomes even more evident. So when you say, why should we live as human beings, or how do you know that that's the right way to do things, or how do you know that that's true? What you're basically asking is, and Rand puts it into very crystal clear language, she says, great questions, let's take this seriously. Why do we need to do anything? Why do we need take any action at all? And this very question is how she demonstrated that human life is the standard of moral value. Because she asked, in effect, what is morality and why do we need it? If we don't need morality, let's throw the thing out and get on with, play soccer or whatever we're going to, football, you guys call it football, whatever we're going to do, right? Let's have a cocktail, whatever it is we're going to do. There's no point in pondering the thing if we don't need it. But if we do need morality, then the reason why we need it is going to help us figure out the facts of reality that give rise to the need of it. When you know the facts of reality that give rise to the need of something, that's when you have objectivity. That's the relationship, the correspondence relationship between the mind and a fact in reality. So when you say, why should we live as a human being, Ayn Rand would say, why do you need the word should at all? If you're going to use the word should, there must be some standard by reference to which something can be good or bad, or you should or shouldn't do something. What is that standard? And she'll say, for instance, why do we need shoulds? Or why do we need values? Or why do we need the concept good? Oh, if we look down deeper in philosophy, we realize that good and should refer to the kinds of actions that we need to take in order to keep ourselves alive, in order to live as the kind of animal that we are. And this is, I'm just touching the surface of the way that she asks a series of questions that bring her all the way down to reality, where she comes to this final conclusion in her theory of why life is the standard of value. She observes that living things need to take certain actions in order to remain alive, so certain actions are necessary for life. And she also observes that only living things can take those kinds of actions. So only living things can pursue values, right? Rocks, rivers, and hammers don't go after things. Plants, animals, and people do. A plant runs its roots to the ground and turns its leaves toward the sky. Why? To go through photosynthesis. Why? So that it can remain alive. A tiger chases an antelope. Why? So that it can get the thing and remain alive. And we pursue our values. Why? So that we can live as human beings. And if we didn't need to take those actions, there would be no such thing as should, good, right, wrong, bad, immoral, any of this language. So Rand's whole thought process on this stuff is always asking why and what depends on what. And once you do that, if you say, well, why should I live? Her answer would be, well, you don't have to. She actually says this in one of her essays, if you don't want to live, you can just stop taking action and nature will take its course. And that's true. But if you want to live, then you must take certain actions. And that's where morality flows from. It's the if you choose to live. So the only reason any shoulds or reasons for anything, by the way, you don't even need an answer to a question unless you choose to live. Why do you need the answer to the question? What are you going to do with it? You don't even want to live. So, I'm just indicating here the depth of the way that she thinks about this stuff, but she has answers to all of these seeming conundrums.
Great. Any more questions?
Hi there, Delina from the IEA. Just a quick one. You mentioned that rights are determined by reason to act in our own accord. How about if there was a circumstance whereby, let's say, a sinister act is reasonable? Would objectivism philosophy allow for it? Yeah, sure. You mentioned that rights are determined by reason to act in our own accord. So let's say there's a circumstance whereby a sinister act is reasonable. Would objectivism allow for it?
Okay. So, great question. If acting rationally is the right way to act, is the morally correct way to act, and somebody says, well, a sinister action, say robbing a bank, seems to me to be rational, I'll get the free stuff and go get it and get to the islands with it, just put a concrete on the table. This kind of thing is what you have in mind?
Yeah, let's say that.
Yeah. So, why wouldn't objectivism say, well, then that's good? And this is because to use your mind in service of your life requires that you use your mind by taking into account the full context of your knowledge and the full context of what it means to live as a human being. And one of the things that we all know on some level, and then if you study philosophy and think about it, you know it much more deeply, is that robbing banks is not a good way to live, right? For many reasons. So first of all, we get our self-esteem and our sense of purpose and of value, self-value in life by doing what? By figuring out what reality is like and being productive, right? Anybody when you work on a school project or some major project in your professional life, and you feel great about your efficacy in doing that and the achievement, and you earn your first paycheck, and you're like, wow, I earned this, right? This is where our self-esteem and our sense of purpose in life comes from. When you become a bank robber or any other kind of parasite on other people intentionally, what you're doing is you're living as less than a human being. That's not a human life. A human life is a life guided by the judgment of your mind, including all the facts you know to be true. And one of the things you know also is that to have really good relationships with people, you need honesty in those relationships, right? You also need the people you have relationships not to be criminals and dishonest people. So if you do get to the island with the free cash that you stole from the bank, all of your relationships are going to begin either with a lie, oh yeah, I earned this on Wall Street, or with, yeah, I'm a criminal too. Are you a criminal? Let's be criminals together. What kind of life is that going to be, right? So what you have to do with these kinds of things, you have to play it out. And you have to say, what does it really mean in the full context, not in the narrow, well, he could get away with the money, and wouldn't he then be rich? And isn't that the meaning of life, to be rich on an island with criminal friends? It just isn't. And so you have to be able to think do what we call full context thinking, taking into account the nature of human life and the facts that make that kind of life possible. And when you do that, what you realize is that having a wonderful career and romantic relationship with someone you love and good friends and wonderful recreation activities and living in a society where people respect each other's rights, that's a human life. And to be an egoist, to be a self-interested person, requires that you do this kind of thinking and that you then pursue that kind of life. The mafia types, they don't live great lives. They live in terror, with low self-esteem, knowing that they're parasites, and they often get shot in the street or thrown in jail. It's just not a good life. So Rand does a whole lot of, explains a whole lot of this kind of thing, and particularly she does so, by the way, in her fiction. You see these things played out in fiction, which is really worth checking out.
I think we've got time for one more question, if anybody has any.
Matthew again, former IEA intern. Could you explain the objectivist position on discrimination and preventing it or not preventing it? As my understanding is that Ayn Rand was against discrimination as she saw it as another form of collectivism, not based in reason, but at the same time she saw civil rights legislation as impinging on individual freedom. So would you be able to talk about this a bit and perhaps explain it?
Yes, great question. And so the question about discrimination and what's the objectivist view on this. Just before we dive into that, the concept of discrimination does not equal like racism, right? And so we'll get to racism in a minute, but we need to discriminate in life in many ways, right? You have to discriminate among friends. Who are you going to befriend and who are you not going to befriend and why, right? So discrimination in hiring, who are you going to hire to work with you, is a really important thing to do. So we don't want to blacklist that idea. What we don't want to do is engage in collectivism, in treating people as not as individuals, but as members of some group that's not even a chosen group, like your race. And Rand regarded racism not only as collectivism, but as the lowliest, most primitive form of collectivism, right? It's like, ugh, me white, you black, you bad, me good, or something. It's just like, it's a caveman philosophy. And she thought it was just the most contemptible way of seeing people and of treating people. So she had utter disregard for that. And the important thing, though, as you mentioned, is that she properly categorized racism simply as a form of a broader thing, namely collectivism. There's different kinds of collectivism. There's racial collectivism, which is particularly primitive. There's economic collectivism, right? The Marxist idea that the proletariat and the bourgeois are forever at odds because one of them is in the owning class and the other is in the working class. She was against that. She said, no, everyone is an individual. It doesn't matter what your class is. If you make a lot of money because you entered a particularly lucrative career and you're really good at it, say a Jeff Bezos or a Martha Stewart or something like that, of course you're going to have a lot of money. You earned the money and that's what you did. If you become a gardener because you love gardening, you're not going to make that kind of money. You might still have a nice life, but there's going to be a huge discrepancy, and that's fine. So she was against collectivizing people in terms of classes. She didn't think it made any difference how much. And this whole business of everybody has to be equal, that's crazy. To live in a world where everyone was just like me would mean we would have no technology whatsoever. I don't know how to make anything technological, right? That would just be a disaster. And we're all individuals, and we need to be able to do our thing. So she's against that kind of collectivism. And she's against every other kind of collectivism. She's against the idea that some group is the unit of moral and political concern. She says there's the smallest minority on earth is the individual. And she's right about that, right? So let's stop treating each other as colors and sexes and people with sex preferences and this, that, and the other. All of that is either unchosen or not relevant to people's moral character. So just let people live and be who they want to be. Protect everyone's right to act on his or her judgment so that they can pursue their own values and live a wonderful life. And the only thing we outlaw in human relationships is the initiation of physical force. You just can't do that thing because when you do it, it stops us from living as human beings. So yeah, she's totally against racism, and she in effect mocked racism. She simultaneously sort of mocked it and went to the core of it in a way that I don't think anyone else had done. By the way, the essay to read is titled Racism, and it's in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. And it's, I think, the most wonderful, scathing thing ever written about this primitive thing called racism.
That's great. Thank you so much, Craig. And before we finish off, if I am a young person that wants to learn a little bit more about objectivism, what should I do? What should I read? Should I look at the OSI and the work that you guys do?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing to do, read Rand, and I always say, read her critically. I read Atlas Shrugged with a book in one hand and a dagger in the other. I was like, if this is, if I'm, because I knew that her ideas were supposed to be controversial, but they were also supposed to have been very, very solidly proven. So while I was reading her fiction and then also later her nonfiction, I read it super critically. You should never accept an idea unless it makes sense to you, including Ayn Rand's ideas. And that's one of the principles of her philosophy, is that you should not accept her ideas or anyone's ideas unless they make sense to you. So read it critically. But do read it, because I think when you do, even if you don't agree with everything, you're going to be like, oh my God, this is serious business. Like this lady had amazing ideas, and either you'll see that they're true, or at least you're going to grapple with some stuff you've never grappled with before. So the first thing is to read her works. Then, if you also would like to engage in some further study, or you can even do this while you're reading her books, I run an organization called Objective Standard Institute, which is an educational organization designed for young people like you to come and take courses on philosophy, not just objectivism. It's on philosophy in general, also the principles of objectivism. So we talk a lot about Rand, but not exclusively about Rand. And we also fold in other ideas that are useful for living a beautiful life and defending liberty on solid ground. So we'll have things like James Clear wrote a book titled Atomic Habits that integrates perfectly with these deeper ideas. So we talk a lot about things like that, and we'll have courses that integrate those kinds of books with Rand's philosophy and other philosophic thinkers. So we do a lot of integration there. It's at objectivestandard.org, and you can sign up for courses. We have full scholarships to get into these courses, and all you have to do is fill out an application. So the courses can be pricey, but if you apply for a scholarship, you're almost certain to get one. So I urge you to go there. I also am the editor-in-chief of a journal that writes about cultural and political issues from an objectivist perspective, and that's titled The Objective Standard, and that's a separate organization, and we've been publishing for 18 years. And if you can't afford a subscription, just go to the subscription page and click on the thing that says I can't afford a subscription, and we'll give you a free subscription for a year, because we don't want money to stop you from being able to learn about these ideas. Also, if you're interested in writing from an objectivist perspective, tag us there also, and you can write for the journal. A lot of people your age do, and we'd love to get you involved if you're interested in that. The last thing I'll say is that Objective Standard Institute, my organization, is throwing a huge conference this summer in Phoenix, Arizona. The conference is titled Level Up, and it's the theme is Philosophy for Freedom and Flourishing. So I regard freedom and flourishing as the two master values, the two things that if you're psychologically healthy, you want to flourish in life. Like if you didn't want to do that, you'd have a psychological problem. So that's flourishing is something that anybody who's psychologically healthy wants to do. Freedom is the political condition you need in order to flourish. And the conference is all about what are the ideas that undergird those two things and make them possible. And so we have Barry Weiss is speaking, James Clear is speaking, the author of Atomic Habits. I'll be speaking. It's like 15 or 16 speakers. There will be about 600, maybe 700 people, mostly people your age there from all over the world. And you can get a scholarship that will fly you to the conference, put you up for 4 nights in a luxury hotel, and fly you back. In other words, we'll cover your travel and your stay and your opening and closing banquets. And they're still available. So go to either levelup.org, levelupconferences.org, or go to Objective Standard Institute and click on it and apply for a scholarship right away. Young people from all over the planet are coming to this conference, and it will absolutely change your life. I guarantee if you come to this conference, you will be a different person when you leave, and in a good way. We have people coming from Africa, from South America, from Iceland, you name it. So I invite you to check that out. If you can't make it this year, it's an annual conference. Come next year, but definitely do that. And feel free to contact me directly if you're moved by anything I've said today and ever want to chat. I'm happy to jump on WhatsApp. We can have a conversation. So just let me know.
That's great. Thank you so much, Craig. I think you deserve a huge round of applause.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.